On February 17, 2026, Iranian state television released footage that most of the world barely noticed at first. Buried beneath the far louder headlines already dominating coverage of the broader military buildup happening across the Gulf at the exact same time, a small missile corvette in the Strait of Hormuz launched a vertical, tube-fired missile that streaked away at more than 5 times the speed of sound. Iran called it the Sayed 3G. 2 weeks later, a completely different Iranian missile, one built for offense rather than defense, slammed into targets near Israel's most sensitive military and government facilities, moving so fast that existing missile defense systems struggled to even track it. By early May, the United States had done something it had never done before in its entire history, requested the deployment of its own hypersonic missile into actual combat, specifically because Iran's weapons had pushed American forces out of range of everything else in the arsenal. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how Iran's hypersonic missile developments forced America's hand, and why the weapon Washington sent in response had never actually been fired in anger before this war. Let's start with that February test, because it's genuinely the opening chapter of this entire story. According to Anadolu Agency's on-the-ground reporting, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy tested the Sayed 3G air defense missile for the first time during what it called the Smart Control exercises in the Strait of Hormuz, launching it from the vessel Shahid Sayed Shirazi. Press TV, Iran's own state broadcaster, described the missile as featuring vertical launch capability with a reported range of 150 kilometers, roughly 93 miles, and said the system was specifically designed to establish a regional air defense umbrella for Iran's newer Shahid Soleimani-class combat vessels. According to more detailed technical reporting cited by Interesting Engineering and separate coverage from defense outlets tracking the test, the Sayed 3G is roughly 7 meters long, weighs around 2,000 kilograms, and reportedly reaches speeds of up to Mach 7, more than 5 times the speed of sound, which by any conventional definition qualifies as hypersonic velocity. Now, I want to be precise about what this missile actually is, because getting this right matters more than making it sound as dramatic as possible. The Sayed 3G is an air defense interceptor, not an offensive strike weapon. Its job is to shoot down incoming aircraft, high-altitude drones, and cruise missiles threatening Iranian warships, not to hit a fixed target on land. That distinction matters, because a missile that travels at hypersonic speed specifically to intercept other fast-moving threats represents a different kind of technological leap than an offensive missile built to strike a city or a military base. What made the Sayed 3G genuinely significant wasn't that it was a new offensive weapon. It was that Iran had, for the first time, successfully adapted a land-based hypersonic speed interceptor system for use at sea, giving its Navy the beginnings of a real area air defense capability inside one of the most contested waterways on the planet, right as American naval forces were building up in the exact same waters. And that timing wasn't a coincidence. According to Fox News' own reporting on the test, Iran announced the Sayed 3G launch specifically as the United States was expanding its military presence in the region amid renewed nuclear talks, with the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier and multiple guided missile destroyers already operating in the Arabian Sea, backed by additional destroyers stationed in the Mediterranean and Red Sea. Global Security's own analysis from the same period noted that Iranian authorities had already warned that even a single shot fired against their forces would trigger a response, language that framed the entire smart control exercise, and the Sayed 3G test specifically, as a direct signal to Washington in the middle of an already tense diplomatic standoff. Army Recognition's detailed technical assessment went further, describing the test as part of an incremental but real evolution in Iranian naval capability, a shift toward compact, fast, missile-dense platforms specifically intended to complicate any future American intervention in the Gulf. It's worth understanding why Tehran was pursuing both of these programs simultaneously, rather than focusing resources on just one. Iran's military planners have spent years operating from a position of acknowledged conventional inferiority against both American and Israeli air power, which has shaped an entire national defense doctrine built around asymmetric deterrence, missiles, drones, proxy networks, and naval mining, rather than trying to match either adversary in traditional air-to-air or blue water naval combat. Within that broader doctrine, a defensive naval interceptor like the Sayed 3G and an offensive strike weapon like the Fattah-2 aren't competing priorities. They're two halves of the same strategic bet. Protect Iran's own naval assets in the Gulf while simultaneously threatening to strike deep inside enemy territory with a weapon existing defenses struggle to stop. That's the logic driving Tehran's investment in hypersonic technology across both categories at once, rather than choosing to specialize in just one. Let's talk about the second, and genuinely more consequential, hypersonic weapon in this story, because this is where Iran's capability shifted from defensive potential to offensive reality. According to Military Watch magazine's detailed reporting, Iran's Fattah-2 missile, a genuinely hypersonic glide vehicle system rather than just a fast-moving interceptor, was first used in actual combat on March 1, 2026, just 2 days after this current war began. That's an important technical distinction worth understanding. A hypersonic glide vehicle doesn't simply travel fast in a straight ballistic arc the way a conventional missile does. It separates from its booster at extreme altitude and then glides, maneuvering unpredictably at hypersonic speed toward its target, which makes it dramatically harder for existing missile defense systems to track and intercept compared to a predictable ballistic trajectory. The stakes of that distinction were laid out plainly by someone with direct professional expertise in exactly this problem. Yuval Beseski, Vice President of Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, Israel's leading missile defense developer, explained the core physics challenge in comments reported by Military Watch magazine back in August 2025, well before this current war even began. Every air defense system today, he said, is based on flying faster than the target. But this principle does not apply to hypersonic missiles. To intercept an object moving at Mach 10, you would need a defense moving at Mach 30, which is impossible in the atmosphere due to friction. Beseski's analogy for the broader defensive challenge was blunt, comparing it to trying to defend basketball star LeBron James with a single defensive player. That's the exact problem Israeli, and by extension, American missile defense planners were staring down as Iran's hypersonic capability moved from prototype to actual combat use in the opening days of this war. It's worth digging a little deeper into exactly why a hypersonic glide vehicle is so much harder to stop than a conventional ballistic missile, because the physics genuinely matter here. A traditional ballistic missile follows a predictable, arcing trajectory once its booster burns out, essentially a very fast, very high-thrown object obeying the same basic laws of motion as anything else in freefall, which means missile defense systems can calculate its future position with a high degree of confidence the moment they detect the launch. A hypersonic glide vehicle breaks that entire predictability model. After separating from its booster, it doesn't simply fall along a fixed arc. It glides through the upper atmosphere at extreme speed while actively maneuvering, changing altitude and direction in ways a defender can't fully anticipate in advance. That combination, extreme speed plus genuine maneuverability, is exactly what Rafael's Yuval Beseski was describing when he explained that intercepting an object at Mach 10 would theoretically require a defensive missile capable of Mach 30, a speed that's simply not achievable for an interceptor traveling through atmospheric friction. That's not a minor technical wrinkle. It's the entire reason hypersonic weapons are treated as such a fundamental challenge to existing missile defense architecture, regardless of which country happens to be fielding them. Let's talk about specifically what that combat use looked like, because the claims themselves generated real controversy about exactly what Iran had actually fired. On March 2nd, 2026, according to reporting from Interesting Engineering, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed it had fired Kyber missiles at senior Israeli government and military positions, specifically targeting the office of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the headquarters of the Israeli Air Force commander, according to IRGC statements carried by Fars news agency. Interesting Engineering's own analysis was careful to note that the exact missile type remained genuinely unclear, raising real questions about whether Iran was testing medium-range ballistic missiles with maneuverable re-entry vehicles, true hypersonic glide vehicles, or some combination presented for maximum propaganda effect. Analysts quoted in that same piece specifically cautioned that impact photos alone were insufficient to determine which missile variant had actually been used, a caveat worth holding on to given how much of this entire hypersonic narrative depends on claims from a government with an obvious incentive to overstate its own capabilities. That same ambiguity extended to a separate, even more dramatic claim later in March. According to reporting from Defense Security Asia, Iran claimed to have struck near Israel's Dimona nuclear research facility with a hypersonic missile following earlier strikes tied to Natanz and Bushehr, in what that outlet described as a scenario raising the specter of a wider nuclear escalation across the Middle East. Crucially, that same reporting noted that Israeli sources said the nuclear research center itself was not actually struck, and that no radiation leaks or structural damage occurred at the facility, even though the impact in the surrounding area did cause injuries and trigger an emergency response. Defense security. Asia's own analysis made an important observation about how these hypersonic claims were actually functioning strategically, noting that the circulation of hypersonic claims serves psychological and informational purposes by suggesting that defenses can be bypassed, and that the perception of capability can be just as strategically influential as the actual verified capability itself. That's a genuinely important lens for understanding this entire story. Part of what Iran's hypersonic missile program has accomplished isn't just physical damage, it's forcing adversaries to treat every single missile launch as a potential hypersonic threat, which changes decision-making and defensive posture, regardless of whether every individual claimed hypersonic strike actually was one. It's worth noting that the Fattah-2's March 2026 combat debut wasn't actually Iran's first use of hypersonic adjacent missile technology in real fighting. According to Military Watch magazine's reporting, the original Fattah missile, a less advanced predecessor to the Fattah-2, was reported by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps to have been used to engage Israeli targets back on June 18, 2025, fired as part of the 11th wave of strikes under an earlier Operation Iran called True Promise 3, launched in response to sustained Israeli air attacks that year. The Corps claimed at the time that missile proved capable of penetrating Israel's multi-layered missile defense network. That earlier use matters because it establishes a longer track record than just this current war alone. Iran had already been testing and refining its hypersonic adjacent missile technology in actual combat conditions for the better part of a year before the Fattah-2. Its more advanced successor, with a true hypersonic gliding warhead, made its own combat debut on February 28, 2026, the same day this current war began. Now, let's get to the part of this story that answers the question in the title directly, because this is where Iran's hypersonic developments produced a genuinely unprecedented American response. According to reporting from the Japan Times, published May 2, 2026, U.S. Central Command formally requested to send the Army's long-delayed Dark Eagle hypersonic missile to the Middle East for possible use against Iran. If approved, that reporting stated plainly, it would mark the first time the United States had ever deployed its hypersonic missile in an actual operational context. A weapon that had been running far behind schedule for years and hadn't even been declared fully operational, even as Russia and China had already deployed their own hypersonic systems. That's a genuinely historic moment buried inside a fairly technical news story, America's newest and most advanced long-range strike weapon, still not officially certified as combat-ready, being rushed toward its first ever real-world use specifically because of the threat Iran's own missile forces posed. And the specific justification for that request is directly tied to Iran's own capabilities, not just to the Dark Eagle's own timeline. According to that same Japan Times reporting, the request for forces submission justified the move by explaining that Iran had moved its launchers out of range of the precision strike missile, an existing American weapon capable of hitting targets at more than 483 kilometers, roughly 300 miles. In other words, American commanders had run out of existing options capable of reaching Iranian missile launchers that had been deliberately repositioned deeper inland, specifically to sit beyond the range of the weapons the United States had already been using against them. The Dark Eagle, with its dramatically longer range and hypersonic speed, was the answer to that exact gap, a weapon originally developed with a very different adversary in mind, most likely Russia or China, being pulled forward for its combat debut against Iran because Tehran's own missile forces had, through repositioning and dispersal, made themselves harder to reach with anything else already in theater. It's worth understanding how Israel's own missile defense community actually responded to this specific challenge, because it wasn't simply resignation in the face of an unstoppable weapon. Rafael's Yuval Baseski, quoted again in Caspian Post reporting, proposed a zone-based defensive model as the practical answer to the hypersonic problem, using multiple interceptors working together to neutralize threats as they approach, rather than relying on any single missile trying to match a hypersonic glide vehicle's speed head-on. That's a meaningful conceptual shift in missile defense doctrine, moving away from the traditional one interceptor per threat model towards something closer to a layered probabilistic defense that accepts no single system can reliably catch a hypersonic weapon alone, but that a coordinated web of overlapping systems might still reduce the overall threat to an acceptable level. Whether that zone-based approach has actually been implemented at scale, and how effective it's proven against Iran's specific hypersonic and hypersonic adjacent missiles in this war, is a separate question. This video's sourcing doesn't fully answer, but the doctrinal shift itself tells you how seriously Israel's own missile defense establishment has had to rethink its fundamental approach in direct response to exactly the weapons covered in this video. Let's talk about what the Dark Eagle actually is, because understanding the weapon itself helps explain why this specific deployment decision carried so much weight. The long-range hypersonic weapon, the Army's official name for the system commonly called Dark Eagle, has been in development for years, consistently facing delays, technical setbacks, and repeated test failures that pushed its timeline well past its original target dates. It's designed to deliver a hypersonic glide body over enormous distances, striking high-value, time-sensitive targets that other systems can't reach quickly enough or from far enough away. The fact that it still hadn't been formally declared fully operational by May 2026, according to the Japan Times, and was being requested for actual combat deployment anyway, tells you just how urgently American commanders assessed the gap Iran's repositioned missile forces had created. This wasn't a routine weapons rotation. It was a request to field an unproven, still developmental system in real combat, because the alternative, leaving those specific Iranian launchers effectively untouchable, was apparently considered the worse option. It's worth understanding a bit more about the weapon Dark Eagle was specifically requested to supplement, because the precision strike missile wasn't some outdated or marginal system being replaced. The PRSM represents one of the U.S. Army's more modern long-range strike weapons, capable of hitting targets beyond 483 kilometers with genuine precision, and it had already been in active use throughout this war as one of the primary tools for reaching Iranian missile infrastructure from American positions in the region. The fact that Iran's own repositioning of its launchers pushed targets beyond even that weapon's reach tells you something important about how seriously Iranian commanders were treating the American strike campaign against their missile forces, actively relocating launchers deeper inland, specifically to force American planners into exactly the kind of capability gap that ultimately produced the Dark Eagle request. That's a genuinely sophisticated defensive adaptation on Iran's part, using geography and repositioning as its own form of countermeasure against American precision strike capability, rather than relying purely on its own missile defenses to intercept incoming American weapons. It's worth stepping back and connecting all three of these threads, because that's really the through line running through this entire story. Iran spent years developing hypersonic and hypersonic-adjacent missile technology across multiple programs simultaneously. The Sayyad 3G for naval air defense, first tested in February, and the Fattah and Fattah-2 for offensive strikes, first used in real combat at the start of March. Both programs, regardless of the genuine uncertainty around specific claims like the Khyber strikes on Israeli targets or the Dimona area impact, forced adversaries to fundamentally reassess what Iran's missile forces were actually capable of. And that reassessment had direct measurable consequences on the American side, contributing to a decision, by early May, to request the first ever combat deployment of America's own hypersonic weapon, specifically because Iran's launchers had moved beyond the reach of everything else already available in the region. It's worth understanding just how bumpy the Dark Eagle's road to this moment actually was, because it makes the decision to rush it toward combat deployment even more significant. The long-range hypersonic weapon program has been plagued for years by delayed test dates, launch failures, and repeated schedule slips that pushed its original target, fielding dates back again and again, well past when the Army had initially hoped to have the system fully operational and ready for units in the field. That track record is exactly why the Japan Times' reporting specifically noted the weapon hadn't even been declared fully operational at the time of CENTCOM's request, a detail that would ordinarily be treated as disqualifying for a first combat deployment under normal circumstances. The fact that American commanders were apparently willing to request its use anyway, gaps in testing and all, tells you just how urgently the specific capability shortfall created by Iran's missile repositioning was being treated inside the Pentagon by early May, urgent enough to consider fielding a still developmental weapon, rather than accepting that certain Iranian targets would simply remain out of reach for the time being. I want to be honest about what remains genuinely uncertain across this entire story, the same way I try to be with every video on this war. Interesting Engineering's own reporting explicitly flagged that the exact missile type used in the Khyber strikes near Netanyahu's office remains unclear, and that impact photos alone can't confirm whether a true hypersonic glide vehicle was actually involved. Defense security. Asia's reporting on the Dimona area strike similarly emphasized that the ambiguity itself has become part of the escalation, with perception of hypersonic capability doing real strategic work, regardless of the underlying technical reality. And while the Japan Times reporting on the Dark Eagle request is specific and well-sourced, describing a formal request for forces submission and citing a person with direct knowledge of it, whether that deployment was ultimately approved and whether the Dark Eagle was actually fired in combat against Iran, are details I haven't found independently confirmed beyond that initial May 2nd report. That's an important distinction to hold on to. A request to deploy a weapon for the first time in history is genuinely significant news on its own, but it's not the same as confirmation that the weapon was actually used. Let's also address the broader pattern this fits inside, because Iran's hypersonic missile ambitions didn't emerge suddenly in 2026. According to Militarny's detailed breakdown of Iran's missile arsenal, Iran unveiled a prototype of the Fattah hypersonic missile with a range of 1,400 kilometers back in 2023. And that same reporting notes that the introduction of new Iranian missile systems has historically proceeded slowly, with new designs often undergoing years of testing following a series of failed launches before ever reaching operational status. That context matters because it means the hypersonic capability Iran demonstrated in this war wasn't some sudden technological leap that appeared out of nowhere. It was the product of years of patient, incremental development, first unveiled as a prototype years before this war, tested and refined, and finally employed in actual combat once the fighting with the United States and Israel began in earnest. There's also a broader regional dimension worth understanding, because Iran wasn't developing this technology in isolation. According to Caspian Post's reporting, The Fattah-2's trajectory and speed characteristics resemble Russia's Oreshnik missile, the hypersonic weapon Russia has used in its own war against Ukraine. A comparison that suggests at least some degree of shared technological lineage or influence between Iran's missile program and Russia's own hypersonic developments. That's consistent with the broader pattern of Iran, Russia, and China all pursuing hypersonic weapons technology roughly in parallel over the past several years, each one watching the other's progress, and each one, in different ways, forcing the United States to accelerate its own hypersonic programs in response. Dark Eagle's long, troubled development timeline exists precisely because American planners have spent years trying to catch up to exactly this kind of multi-front hypersonic proliferation, and Iran's specific contribution to that broader picture, however uncertain some of the individual strike claims remain, was serious enough to trigger a request for that program's actual combat debut. It's worth widening the lens one more time before we close, because Iran's hypersonic developments didn't happen in a vacuum, separate from what China and Russia have already been doing for years. China has fielded operational hypersonic glide vehicles across multiple missile systems for the better part of a decade, and has conducted test after test demonstrating maneuverable, hard-to-track re-entry capability that American defense planners have spent years publicly worrying about. Russia's Oreshnik, referenced earlier for its trajectory similarities to Iran's Fattah-2, represents that same country's own answer to the same broader technological race. Seen against that backdrop, Iran's entry into this specific category of weapons technology, however uncertain some of its individual combat claims remain, represents a genuine expansion of the number of state and non-aligned actors capable of fielding this kind of threat, moving hypersonic weapons from a two-power problem, primarily concerning China and Russia, into a genuinely multipolar challenge that American and allied missile defense planners now have to account for across an even wider range of potential adversaries and regional flashpoints simultaneously. So, where does all of this leave us? Iran spent years quietly developing hypersonic and near-hypersonic missile technology across two very different programs. One defensive, protecting its own naval forces in the Strait of Hormuz, and one offensive, aimed at striking Israeli and implicitly American targets with weapons designed specifically to defeat existing missile defense systems. Both programs reached genuine operational milestones within days of each other at the very start of this war, the Sayyad 3G's naval debut in mid-February, and the Fattah-2's first combat use on March 1st. And by early May, those combined developments had pushed the United States toward a decision with no real precedent in American military history, requesting to deploy its own hypersonic weapon in actual combat for the very first time, specifically because Iran's own missile forces had made themselves harder to reach with everything else already available. Whatever the ultimate outcome of that specific deployment request, the sequence of events leading up to it tells a genuinely significant story about how quickly this war pushed both sides toward using technology neither had ever actually tested under real combat conditions before. It's worth remembering, before we get to the closing question, that every one of these technical and strategic details ultimately translates into real risk for the actual people operating in this environment. American sailors aboard the destroyers and carriers, positioned in the Strait of Hormuz throughout this war, have had to factor Iran's naval air defense capability, including systems like the Sayyad 3G, directly into their own operational planning, understanding that Iranian vessels now carry a genuinely faster, longer-range interceptor than they did before this war began. Israeli civilians and military personnel near the specific facilities targeted by Iran's offensive hypersonic and hypersonic-adjacent missiles have had to live with the knowledge that their existing missile defense systems, however sophisticated, may simply not be able to guarantee protection against this specific class of threat. And American forces potentially operating the Dark Eagle for the first time in actual combat would be doing so with a weapon system that hasn't completed the kind of extensive operational testing normally required before a system like this gets fielded, adding a genuine layer of uncertainty and risk on the American side of this story as well. None of the strategic significance covered in this video changes the fact that real people on multiple sides of this conflict are the ones actually living with the consequences of this specific hypersonic arms race in real time. Every figure and claim in this video comes from named on-the-record reporting, Anadolu Agency and Press TV's own coverage of the Sayyad 3G test, technical analysis from Army Recognition and Military Watch magazine, Fox News and Global Securities, reporting on the broader military buildup surrounding these events, Interesting Engineering's careful, appropriately hedged coverage of the Khyber missile claims, Defense Security Asia's reporting on the Dimona area strike and its own explicit caveats about verification, Militarny's historical breakdown of Iran's missile development timeline, Caspian Post comparison to Russia's Oreshnik system, and the Japan Times is reporting on the Dark Eagle deployment request specifically. Where a claim remains genuinely unverified, like the exact missile type used against Israeli targets in early March, or whether the Dark Eagle request was ultimately approved and fired. I've told you that explicitly rather than presenting uncertain claims as settled fact. There's a defense industry dimension worth including here too, because a first-ever combat deployment request for a program as troubled as Dark Eagle carries real weight inside the Pentagon's broader budget and procurement debates. Programs that have suffered years of delays and test failures are often vulnerable to cancellation or major restructuring, especially when defense budgets face pressure from competing priorities. A successful, or even simply an actually executed combat deployment against Iran would give Dark Eagle's advocates inside the military and in Congress genuinely powerful evidence that the program, despite its rocky development history, can deliver real operational value when it matters most. Conversely, any failure during this specific deployment, whether tactical or technical, would hand ammunition directly to critics who've spent years arguing the program has consumed enormous resources without ever proving it can perform as originally promised. That's a meaningful part of why this specific request carries stakes well beyond just the immediate tactical question of reaching a handful of relocated Iranian missile launchers. It's also, in a very real sense, a test of whether one of the Army's most expensive and most delayed modern weapons programs can finally justify its own existence in actual combat. So here's my question for you. Given that Iran's hypersonic missile developments, both defensive and offensive, appear to have directly triggered America's decision to deploy its own hypersonic weapon in combat for the first time in history, do you think that represents a genuine, lasting shift in the regional balance of power? Or was this always going to happen eventually, with Iran's specific missile tests simply providing the immediate occasion for a hypersonic arms race that the United States, Russia, and China were already racing toward, regardless of what happened in Tehran this particular year? Or does the sheer scale of investment already sunk into this specific rivalry mean the trajectory was essentially locked in regardless of any single test, any single strike claim, or any single deployment request covered in this video, with Iran simply being the specific spark that happened to ignite a fuse that had already been laid years in advance? Let me know where you land on this in the comments. I read every single one of them. Thanks so much for watching this full breakdown, and I'll see you in the next one.